On the morning of the Sommaire fete, St. Mary Mead was at its most innocent. The sky held that peculiar pearly English brightness, which promises neither sun nor rain, but something temperate and altogether decent. The bunting had been hung across the green, the cake stall arranged with the ruthless competitiveness, and Vicar Terwilska's wife had already begun to worry, quite properly, about the jam situation. Miss Jane Marple, sitting by her cottage window with her knitting, had a very good view of the activity. She saw the Boy Scouts attempting to erect a tent and tangling the ropes with that fervent incompetence peculiar to boys in groups, watched Mrs. Lestrange carry an enormous sponge cake as if it were a crown upon her head, and noted, with approval, that the vicar had not forgotten to roll up his sleeves before lifting trestle tables. Men who did things in their Sunday coats, Miss Marple always thought, were not to be relied upon. Across the lane, the cottage that had once belonged to the late Colonel Prothero now housed an incomer, Mr. Leonard Frobisher, a retired stockbroker with a florid complexion, silver hair, and the air of a man accustomed to being important in offices with thick carpets. He had been in St. Mary Mead for just under a year, long enough to be familiar, but not nearly long enough to be known. Miss Marple, who believed very firmly that people repeated themselves rather than changed, had made certain quiet observations. Mr. Frobisher walked like a man who expected doors to open before him. He talked too loudly about taking things easily now, and being quite out of the city game. Yet he was often seen emerging from the little branch bank in Much Benham with a briefcase that sagged under its own weight. Retired meant a variety of things, Miss Marple knew, some quite respectable, some rather less so. The fete itself began, as these things do, with a great deal of confusion that soon settled into habit. Money changed hands, scandalous amounts of sugar were consumed by small children with alarming cheeks, and anxious ladies hovered over sponge cakes that by 3 o'clock had become relics of former perfection. Mr. Frobisher arrived late, as important men so often simped and so often liked to do. He was in high good humour, booming out compliments to the ladies of positively professional Mrs. Price Ridley, and making a considerable fuss over the tombola. He bought ostentatiously a strip of tickets from young Cherry Jameson, who blushed, giggled, and later confided to her friend that he'd pressed an extra half-crown into her hand for being a pretty girls. "You mark my words," said Mrs. Weatherby in the tea-tent. "That man is a flirt, a city flirt, and nothing good ever came out of the city, except perhaps railway shares." It was not, however, Mr. Frobisher's flirting that later shocked St. Mary Mead, but his punctuality. For at precisely 4:30, when the judging of the flower arrangements was reaching its most acrimonious stage, Mr. Leonard Frobisher excused himself from the coconut shy, consulted a gold pocket watch, and said to no one in particular that he must just pop back home a moment for a very delicate matter. Mrs. Marple, who happened to be passing, heard this phrase and tucked it gently away in that mental drawer where she filed the small, easily overlooked things that other people forgot 5 minutes after hearing them. A delicate matter could mean almost anything. But men who spoke of delicacy usually meant money or women, and money was, in Miss Marple's experience, both more common and more dangerous. It was barely 20 minutes later that the first scream was heard. It came from Dora Simpkins, Mr. Frobisher's daily help, who had returned from her sister's cottage early, and found her employer lying on the polished parquet floor of his study, quite dead, a heavy brass poker beside him. The curious thing, as the village would repeat with horrified relish for weeks to come, was not the poker, nor even the blood. It was the safe. Mr. Frobisher had died no more than 10 feet from it. The door of the safe stood wide open, and as Dora Simpkins kept telling anyone who would listen, there wasn't so much as a postage stamp missing. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the long case clock in the hall, marking off seconds that no longer belonged to Arthur Penhaligon. It was Mrs. Weatherby, a fluttery woman who wore mauve as a sort of moral protection, who gave a little scream. Sylvia staggered forward, then stopped short of the body as if an invisible barrier held her back. Julian, his face curiously pale, said in a strained voice, "Good Lord, is he—" Miss Marple, who had seen death in many guises and at many inconvenient moments, moved quietly to the sideboard and rang the small brass bell for the maid. "We must send at once for Dr. Haydock," she said, her tone gentle but practical. "And for the police, I think." There was a flurry of confused movement. Julian and Arthur knelt beside his uncle with reluctant hands, as though half afraid Arthur might suddenly object. "He's cold," he muttered, then corrected himself uneasily. "No, not cold, but he's not breathing." He looked at Sylvia almost accusingly, as if she might have an explanation tucked into her evening bag. Sylvia pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "He was perfectly well, perfectly only half an hour ago," she whispered. "He went in to deal with some papers. He said so." Miss Marple's blue eyes moved, apparently vaguely, around the study. It was a pleasant room, tastefully furnished, but with that faintly ostentatious air of new money anxious to communicate solidity. On the wall above the writing desk, the new safe gleamed dully, its door flung open like a mouth interrupted in mid-speech. From where she stood, Miss Marple could see that the interior shelves were neat, almost obsessively so. A leather document wallet, a small metal cash box, several flat velvet cases. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed. Best not to touch anything more than necessary. Miss Marple said, almost apologetically, as Julian's hand hovered near Arthur's shoulder. "In such circumstances, the police do like things left just so." He withdrew his hand as if burned. "Of course, yes, quite right." Then, with a mechanical sense of duty, he went to obey Miss Marple's earlier suggestion and telephoned the doctor. While they waited, the other guests drifted into the study in twos and threes, as villagers will, propelled by horror, curiosity, and that underlying conviction that, important, things were inherently communal. Low murmurs filled the room. "Heart," Mrs. Weatherby declared to Ada Price in an undertone that was nevertheless clearly audible. "Has to be. Men of his age and all that excitement about money." "Or stroke," Ada ventured. "My sister's husband's cousin dropped just like that in his chicken run. Face down same as Mr. Penhaligon." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Safe wide open like that and nothing gone. Well, you may say natural causes if you like, I don't. Mark my words, there's something decidedly queer." Mrs. Marple, who knew Miss Hartnell's passion for the decidedly queer, allowed her gaze to come to rest upon Arthur's outstretched hand. His fingers were slightly curled, as though they had been clutching something a moment before and then lost hold of it. On the carpet nearby lay a small crushed object, a fragment of white paper or card. No one seemed to notice it. The maid, arriving in a state bordering on collapse, stepped neatly over it without looking down. Dr. Haydock arrived within 20 minutes, brisk and competent, with his worn bag and his professional frown. He knelt, turned the body with an economy of movement that bespoke long practice, and after a few moments looked up. "He's dead. Yes. Been dead not very long, half an hour, perhaps a little more." He hesitated, then added it in a tone that instantly sharpened every ear in the room. "And I don't care for the look of this at all." "Not his heart, then, Mrs.?" Weatherby inquired tremulously. "Possibly," de Haydock said, "but possibly not. I should prefer not to commit myself." His eyes flicked briefly toward Mr. Marple with the faintest suggestion of shared understanding. "In any case, the police had better take charge. I'll telephone Inspector Slack." At the name, Miss Marple's needles, which she had unconsciously picked up again, paused momentarily. Inspector Slack had his virtues, she always said, but subtlety was not among them. While Dr. Haydock went to the telephone, Julian drifted over to the safe and peered in with an air of baffled resentment. "Everything seems to be here," he said. "The manuscript, the cash, the jewellery cases. I don't understand." "It is so often the case," Mrs. Marple observed mildly, "that what one does not understand is more important than what one does. I remember a very curious incident in Much Benham about a pudding basin and a jar of pickled walnuts. No one could make it out at all to begin with. But in the end, it turned out to be the one thing that explained everything." Sylvia looked at her blankly, then back at the body on the carpet. "Do you mean—" she began, and stopped, as the distant sound of a motor car turning into the gravel drive announced the arrival of Inspector Slack. By evening, St. Mary Mead was humming like a disturbed beehive. The particulars of Penhaligon's death, having passed through no fewer than 6 sets of lips, emerged garbled yet curiously embellished at the Blue Boar, the post office, and Mrs. Hartnell's kitchen in quick succession. According to Mrs. Price Ridley, Arthur had been found clutching a blood-stained dagger and gasping out the name of his murderer. This was firmly contradicted by Mr. A. Tompkins, the grocer, who assured his afternoon customers that Arthur had been discovered with his hand upon the safe door, evidently poisoned by foreign substance smeared upon. "The handle, like you hear about in those spy stories," he added darkly, By the time the milk had been delivered to the far end of the village, Arthur's death was being confidently attributed to a smuggled cobra. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her familiar corner of the drawing room at the vicarage later that evening, listened to Mrs. Weatherby's breathless account with the patient expression of one accustomed to separating fact from embroidery. "And they say, Mrs. Upsetter," Weatherby concluded, "that poor Sylvia has taken to her bed and refuses to speak to anyone. Utterly prostrated, naturally. Though I did hear, as from Mrs. Jeffries, her cousin does some sewing for Sylvia, you know, that she and Mr. Penhaligon had quarrelled dreadfully last week. Something about her change in his will." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for the briefest of moments. "How very trying for the poor girl," she murmured. "Money matters do so often create unpleasantness in families. I remember when old Miss Taverner decided to leave his draper's shop to his housekeeper. His nephew didn't speak to him again for 3 years. Quite ruined the harvest festival that year." The vicar's wife, Griselda, perched on the arm of a chair, regarded Stipple. Miss Marple, with that mixture of amusement and respect she always felt when the old lady began making her apparently rambling remarks. "You saw everything this afternoon, Jane. What do you think really happened?" "Oh, my dear, I was merely present," Miss Marple replied. "Seeing is quite a different matter. Still, there were one or two little things." She trailed off, her gaze temporarily distant. Griselda leaned forward. "Such as?" "Well," Miss Marple said slowly, "Mr. Penhaligon struck me as a man who liked to show off his possessions. People of that kind rarely go to look at them alone. A new safe, valuable manuscripts, one would expect an audience, wouldn't one? And yet he went into the study by himself." "That might have been coincidence," Griselda suggested. "Possibly, but it reminded me very much of old Mr. Pierce in Little Fenton, the one who collected silver teaspoons. He was only ever alone with his collection when he wished to change his will. A very human tendency, to be private at the moment when one is altering the future." There was a brief silence as Griselda considered this. "You don't really think his will is involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, my dear, whenever there is a substantial estate and an unexpected death, it is safest to assume that someone has been counting chickens rather prematurely." At that moment the vicar entered, carrying the Evening Post. "Telegram for you, Miss Marple," he announced, looking faintly surprised. "For me?" She took it with steady hands, unfolding the flimsy paper. Her eye scanned the message, and for the first time that day, an unmistakable flicker of interest crossed her face. "From Dolly Bantry," she explained. "It seems her cousin's husband is a solicitor in— oh, how curious— in the very firm that handled Mr. Penhaligon's affairs. She suggests that I might find certain arrangements of his quite illuminating." Griselda's eyes widened. How on earth did Dolly hear so quickly? "The same way St. Mary Mead always hears," Miss Marple said placidly. "By tea time." Outside, the church clock struck 9, its chimes carrying across the quiet village. Within the small, cosy room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with undisturbed regularity. But her thoughts were far from tranquil. Already, in the neat compartments of her mind, the people connected with Arthur Penhaligon, Julian, Sylvia, the servants, even the village itself, were taking up their places, each with a little question mark politely hovering above their heads. 2 days later, the letter alluded to in Dolly Bantry's telegram arrived, thick and important looking, bearing the seal of Fothergill, Price, and Pennington. Miss Marple opened it with care, smoothing the pages before her on the small table by the window, where the light was best for reading and for knitting. Dolly's covering note was brief and characteristically blunt. "My dear Jane, Geoffrey, a wretched but useful man, says Arthur Penhaligon had his will altered not once but twice in the last 6 months. I knew there'd be something. Do make sense of it as only you can. D. The enclosed statement from Geoffrey Fothergill was more precise. The first change, 4 months ago, had disinherited a distant cousin in favour of Julian the nephew. The second, dated only a fortnight before Arthur's death, introduced a new codicil, a substantial annuity for Sylvia Driftwood, to be paid regardless of whether the engagement ended in marriage or not. In the event of Arthur's death before the wedding, she would still receive a generous income for life. Miss Marple read that portion twice, her lips pursing slightly. It was a very unusual arrangement, and unusual arrangements in wills tended, in her experience, to cast long shadows. That same afternoon, Inspector Slack called at Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly to bring an update as a courtesy, though his manner suggested he fully expected to enlighten, not be enlightened. He was shown in and somewhat disconcerted to find Dr. Haydock already present, sat a trifle more stiffly than usual on the edge of the armchair. "We are making progress, Miss Marple," he announced. "The digitalis confirms we are dealing with deliberate poisoning, and we have motive, opportunity, and prior quarrels neatly wrapped up in one Edward Whodunit advance. The embezzlement is quite clear without a cut. Bank records don't lie." Haydock snorted softly. "Bank records don't wield teapots either, Slack." Slack ignored the interruption. Vance had access to the accounts, knew discovery was imminent, and was seen arguing with Penhaligon that very afternoon. "We've also found a small bottle in his desk, label removed, but it contained traces of digitalis. He claims it's for his nerves. Likely story." Miss Marple, who had been placing a row of delicate little eyelets into her knitting, looked mildly surprised. "How curious, Mr. Vance does not look to me like a man who self-medicates." "Indeed, good. He struck me as the sort who follows instructions rather precisely, especially from those he considers his betters." Slack frowned. "You always say they don't look like murderers, Miss Marple, right up until they are." "Oh, not at all," she protested gently. "I've known several people who looked precisely like murderers, and obligingly turned out to be so, but it is so seldom as simple as a man helping himself to the family funds and then to the digitalis bottle. One wonders why a person intending so clever a murder would keep the incriminating bottle in his own desk when the garden offers so many foxgloves." Her point hung delicately in the air, like a thread waiting to be picked up. Slack cleared his throat. "We can't ignore what we have in front of us. There's also the matter of Arthur going to the safe to fetch the ledgers after their quarrel. Vance admits that. He says Arthur never returned, and he went out to the garden so as not to cause a scene. Very convenient." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the tall spikes of foxglove nodded gently in the breeze. "And yet," she said, "Mr. Penhaligon died 10 feet from his safe, which stood open and undisturbed, almost as if the safe itself were meant to be the centre of attention, like a conjurer's hat." "Distraction, you mean, Dr. Haydock prompted. "People are very easily diverted," Miss Marple replied. "Particularly when money is involved. It reminds me of old Mr. Harper at the Drapers, who used to drop his measuring tape right at the crucial moment whenever a lady questioned the bill." Slack rose, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers. "So, while some of us chase measuring tapes and Drapers, I shall be interviewing Miss Sylvia Driftwood again. We have statements that she'd been overheard saying she couldn't wait much longer for Arthur to do the decent thing. And there's this business of her being seen near the old mill with a man last week. Time we put some proper questions to her." "Do be careful, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, "and young women in love or out of it are apt to say rather more than they mean. A foolish assignation does not necessarily lead to murder." Her needles clicked twice more before she added, almost as an afterthought, "though sometimes it does." When Slack had gone, Haydock regarded her over his teacup. "You're not satisfied with Vance as your murderer?" "Oh, I am very satisfied with him as a murderer," Miss Marple answered serenely. "I am merely not yet satisfied that he is this murderer." Miss Marple did not have to wait until afternoon for the next thread to present itself. It came, as threads so often did in St. Mary Mead, under the guise of a social call. Mrs. Price Ridley encountered her outside the post office just before luncheon, her hat slightly askew with the weight of fresh scandal. "My dear Miss Marple, you really ought to know. Poor Sylvia Driftwood is quite beside herself, man. Hasn't slept, won't eat a thing. Mrs. Geoffrey says she keeps asking if the police have searched the safe properly. Terribly odd, don't you think, when the man died 10 feet from it?" Miss Marple tilted her head in gentle inquiry. "I might think if the contents are safe, that would be reassuring." "Exactly so, but according to Geoffrey's, Sylvia keeps muttering that Arthur may have hidden something in there recently, something that could ruin everything." Mrs. Price Ridley lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between ourselves, I never trusted that woman. Engagement or not, one could see she was after security. A fortune hunter Jane as plain as the nose on your face." Miss Marple, who who had seen many varieties of fortune hunters, and some quite sympathetic, did not comment. Instead she asked, with apparent innocence, "And has dear Sylvia any family visiting? One does so need support at such a time." "Only that cousin of her," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "The dark one with the rather theatrical hair. Mr. Lionel Drake. Turned up last week. Not at the garden party, mind you. Migraine," Sylvia said. "Convenient, I call it." The name Lionel Drake joined the pattern forming in Miss Marple's mind alongside Julian, Sylvia and Edward Vance. She spent the early afternoon in quiet domestic occupations, yet her thoughts kept circling back to the open safe and Arthur's outstretched hand 10 feet. It was a distance that felt less like chance and more like intention. Later that day she walked, with apparent aimlessness, toward Rosemary Cottage. The police cordon had been removed. Only a discreet constable remained at the gate, who, knowing Miss Marple's standing in the village and perhaps the inspector's wary respect for her instincts, allowed her to pass with a polite nod. Sylvia received her in the small morning room, looking pale and fragile in a cream dressing gown that had just a trace too much elegance for true invalidism. Her eyes were reddened, but Miss Marple noted the absence of the puffy lids that came with sustained tears. It spoke more of disturbed sleep than uncontrollable grief. "You are so kind, Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice quivering at precisely rehearsed intervals. "Everyone's talking, I know they are, about wills and money and such horrid things." "It is only natural under the circumstances," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing. "People must talk about something, you know. Silence makes them quite nervous. I brought you some of my lavender biscuits. I always find a little something sweet can be a comfort when one is quite unable to face proper food." Sylvia managed a faint smile. "You are an angel. Arthur always said village people were terrible gossips, but I think there is such kindness here too." Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the silver tea tray set carefully on the low table. 2 cups, one unused, the other bearing faint lipstick marks. "You have a visitor, my dear?" "My cousin Lionel. He went out for a walk. He's been wonderful. Arthur never approved of him, you know. Thought him idle. But Lionel has been my rock since it happened." "Was he here on the day of the garden party?" Miss Marple asked, apparently as an afterthought. "In his room. Those awful migraines. Arthur said it was malingering." Sylvia's hands twisted the lace edge of her handkerchief. "Miss Marple, do you think they'll arrest Edward? I heard about the bottle they found. Arthur told me he suspected him of stealing, but to poison, it seems monstrous. Most people are capable of something monstrous," Miss Marple said gently, "given the right provocation and the wrong temptation, though in my experience real criminals usually prefer other people to take the blame." She let the remark hang a moment, watching Sylvia's reaction. There was a flicker. Fear first, then calculation, as though the young woman were rapidly assessing what Miss Marple might know. "It is all so bewildering," Sylvia whispered. "Arthur changed things so suddenly. One day we were planning our wedding, the next he was talking about reassessing commitments. I was sure someone had been poisoning his mind against me. Julian, perhaps, nor Edward." "Did Arthur mention making changes to his will?" Miss Marple asked, keeping her voice mild. "He threatened to," Sylvia admitted, then flushed. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but he liked power, Miss Marple. He liked to see people dance when he pulled the strings." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a small side table, where a florist's card lay half concealed beneath lilies already beginning to brown at the edges. She rose, apparently to straighten the drooping blooms, and her eye fell, quite accidentally it would have seemed, on the card's inscription. "Deepest sympathy, J.P." The handwriting was strong, masculine, oddly formal for a nephew. It was the abbreviation that interested Miss Marple. Julian Penhaligon almost always signed his name in full. She had seen enough of his checks, cards and club notices in the village to know that. Yet here, in his sympathy card to his uncle's fiancée, he had chosen anonymity of a sort. She tucked the observation away. People betrayed themselves in the smallest of choices. As she took her leave, Miss Marple encountered Julian himself at the front door, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly at the sight of her. "Paying condolences, Miss Marple?" he asked. "I do hope you are not overtaxing poor Sylvia. These are difficult days." "Grief is tiring, but so is uncertainty," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I fancy certainty, when it comes, will be far more exhausting for some people than for others." Julian's eyes met hers just a shade too long before he stepped aside. Behind him, down the hall, the door to Arthur's study stood ajar, revealing just a glimpse of the gleaming steel safe. 10 feet of carpet separated that open door from the spot where Arthur had fallen. Miss Marple had the sudden, distinct impression that Arthur had been walking away from the safe with his mind on something entirely different, perhaps not his treasures at all when death had come. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, she thought, there was someone who knew precisely what that something had been. Miss Marple did not, of course, rush after Julian in a dramatic manner. That was not her way. Instead, she walked sedately home and sent a small boy, Tommy Haydock, whose curiosity was only matched by his speed, to run an errand to the station on the pretext of delivering a parcel to his aunt. By tea time she had her answer. Julian had taken the London train, purchasing a ticket only as far as Paddington and asking with careless nonchalance that fooled no one at the window which Underground line served Charing Cross and the Strand. That same evening Inspector Slack appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, looking more disgruntled than usual. He accepted a cup of tea and a slice of Madeira cake, then came to the point in his brisk manner. "You've been making your own inquiries again, Miss Marple. I've had 3 separate reports of you talking to Mrs. Bantock, Sylvia Driftwood, and half the village. I suppose you also know that Julian Penhaligon has gone up to London." "I'd gathered as much," Miss Marple replied mildly. "The Strand, I understand." Slack frowned. "We've traced his movements as far as the Savoy. Paid a call there just after 2 o'clock. We've no warrant to demand details, but the desk clerk recalled him asking for a Mr. David Hartley. The same name, I might add, that appears on a telegram sent from the village yesterday. Sylvia Driftwood's telegram." Miss Marple's expression remained tranquil, but her thoughts were sharp. Sylvia's last-minute conscience, Julian's hasty journey, and David Hartley at the Savoy, too many threads now converged at the same point. "There's more," Slack continued grudgingly. "We've had word from Bath. Your rare books dealer, Arlington Rare Books, confirms the Salters' existence and Penhaligon's negotiations, but the dealer swears the final payment was never made. Claims Penhaligon cancelled the transaction the day before he died, saying a more urgent matter had arisen." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "So the money withdrawn for the Salter is unaccounted for." "Exactly. And in the meantime, Vance looks worse by the minute. He can't explain how the Digitalist bottle came to be in his desk. Claims he doesn't even know what it looks like in raw form. I dare say he's right. The man's more at home with ledgers than plants, but he still had every reason to want Penhaligon out of the way. Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "and someone wanted him to appear to have that reason." Slack snorted but did not argue. His violence was almost an admission that her point had occurred to him as well. The next morning brought the twist that altered the shape of the whole affair. Dolly Bantry telephoned, her voice crackling with excitement. "Jane, Geoffrey has just rung from London. There's been a most extraordinary commotion at the firm. A messenger from Penhaligon's bank delivered a sealed packet this morning, to be opened only in the event of Arthur's death. Inside was a letter and a key. The letter instructs Geoffrey to retrieve certain private papers from a deposit box at the bank, papers concerning the last alteration to his will and what he calls evidence of attempted fraud by parties close to me. Geoffrey went at once." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the receiver. "And the key? That's just it. It doesn't fit the bank's box at all. They've checked twice. Wrong lock entirely. Geoffrey is convinced it belongs to something else. A safe or strong box?" He said Arthur seemed quite amused when he deposited the envelope. Said something about foxes being very sure of their own cleverness. Miss Marple replaced the telephone with a thoughtful expression. A key sent to a solicitor that did not fit the expected lock. A missing blue envelope once waved before Julian, and a wall safe standing open beside a dead man who had never written down his combination. It suggested a small but crucial alteration in perspective. By midday, another piece fell into place. Bantock, summoned to the inquest's preliminary proceedings, let slip under questioning that Arthur had recently installed a slim new thing in his study, a concealed compartment behind the bookcase, like in those detective stories, as she dismissively put it. He'd been quite pleased with himself and had told her she was the only one who needed to know in case of fire. Only, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home past the quiet hedgerows, Arthur had been exactly the kind of man who could not resist boasting to someone of his cleverness. And someone had learned that the real security in Rosemary Cottage did not lie in the impressive wall safe at all. The key in London that fitted no bank box, the blue envelope missing from the safe, and Arthur's body 10 feet away from that ostentatious piece of steel suggested a quiet, devastating possibility. The murder had been committed not to open the safe, but to make it seem as though the safe had been the point of everything. Which left, of course, the question of who had needed that impression most desperately. The next morning brought rain, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the outlines of St. Mary Mead and seemed to dampen, but not extinguish, the village's appetite for speculation. Miss Marple, however, found rain extremely conducive to thought. It discouraged unnecessary callers and allowed her to sit quietly by the parlour de jour window, knitting in hand, while her mind arranged the facts of Arthur Penhaligon's death into their proper order. By 11 o'clock, the drizzle had settled into a finer mist when the doorbell rang. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Granger, looking uncharacteristically flustered. Jane, I simply had to tell you at once. There's a stranger at the Blue Boar. Arrived on the morning train, asked for directions to Rosemary Cottage and the Driftwood place. Calls himself Mr. David Hartley. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. How very prompt. One might almost say punctual. Mrs. Granger lowered her voice. And Jane, this is rather delicate, but Mrs. Jeffreys is at the post office, swears she saw Sylvia Driftwood slipping a note under the Blue Boar's side door not an hour ago. Miss Marple thanked her and, after a moment's reflection, put on her waterproof and took her small umbrella. It would be most interesting, she thought, to see Mr. Hartley in his natural habitat rather than presented to her through other people's descriptions. There was nothing like the first sight of a person to tell one what one needed to know. At the Blue Boar she found Mr. Hartley exactly as she had expected, and, at the same time, not at all. He was in his early 30s, well dressed without ostentation, with the easy charm of a man accustomed to hotel lounges and discreet convoyings. Yet there was a certain hardness around the eyes, a calculation in the way he measured the room that Miss Marple had seen before, in a young man who had attempted to marry the grocer's daughter for her anticipated inheritance, and in a commercial traveller who sold defective vacuum cleaners to widows. He rose politely when she approached, having already been informed by Mrs. Finch, the landlady, that Miss Marple knows everything worth knowing about this village. Mr. Hartley, I believe, she said gently. How very kind of you to visit St. Mary Mead under such unhappy circumstances. He studied her for a beat too long before smiling. I came as soon as I could, Miss Marple. Sylvia wrote to me some weeks ago about her engagement to Mr. Penhaligon. I felt, quite understandably, I hope, a certain concern. Quite naturally, Miss Marple agreed. An old attachment, I believe. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. We were close once, but Arthur's money was a powerful inducement to change her circumstances. I cannot exactly blame her, though I regretted it. Miss Marple observed him with the mild interest she might show a new brand of knitting wool. And your business in London, Mr. Hartley? You are, I understand, connected with rare books. His surprise seemed genuine. Ah, Arthur mentioned me, did he? Yeah, I act as an intermediary in certain discreet transactions. Private collections, difficult to value items. I was, in fact, advising him about that salter he wanted from Bath. That detail aligned a little too perfectly with Edward Vance's account. Miss Marple thought of the missing cash, the cancelled transaction, and Sylvia's frantic telegram. Cannot go through with it. Must speak urgently. I wonder, she said mildly, whether poor Mr. Penhaligon discovered that some of his acquisitions were not quite what they seemed. Forged manuscripts can be so very good nowadays, I'm told, though not, of course, good enough to deceive an expert for very long. For the first time, Hartley's composure slipped. If Arthur believed that, he was mistaken. My role was purely advisory. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. One hears such stories, that is all, and I suppose your interest now is purely sentimental. His pause was almost imperceptible. And legal, he admitted. Sylvia wrote that Arthur was planning to make a new will. If he has died intestate or with an earlier version in place, certain obligations arise. I may be called upon to assist her. Miss Marple left him soon after, apparently satisfied with their conversation. But as she walked back through the mist, she considered what she had observed. David Hartley knew far too much about Arthur's financial arrangements for a man whose connection was merely advisory. So more importantly, though, he had responded to the suggestion of forgery not with indignation but with concern, like a man wondering how much had been discovered before the old bullion broker died. That afternoon, a new development shook the village. There had been a break-in at Rosemary Cottage. Nothing taken from the safe, of course, said the gossips. It was already empty of excitement, but a locked drawer in Arthur's desk had been forced. According to Mrs. Bantock, the only thing missing from it was a small black notebook in which Arthur kept jotted memoranda. Private notes, she said, about people and business, names, dates, that sort of thing. Miss Marple, hearing this, thought again of Arthur's remark to his solicitor. Let them show their true colours when they think they're still in my good graces. A careful man like Arthur, suspecting deceit, would not rely solely on a will to settle his accounts. He would keep records, quiet, damning records that a forger, an embezzler, or disappointed heir would be desperate to destroy. And now that someone had risked a second crime to obtain that little black book, Miss Marple knew the noose, however invisible, was beginning to tighten around the true culprit. The rain cleared overnight, leaving St. Mary Mead washed and glistening, as though the village itself wished to distance its appearance from recent events. The illusion of freshness, however, did nothing to alter the underlying tensions. By mid-morning, the atmosphere felt charged, like the brief pause before a summer storm. Miss Marple, having finished her modest breakfast, received another visitor. This time Sylvia Driftwood, pale and agitated, her usually immaculate appearance somehow untidy, appeared. The edges. Miss Marple, she began without preamble. I had to speak to someone who isn't, she gestured vaguely, who isn't trying to decide if I'm a murderess. Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried precision. People do so like to decide things quickly, my dear. It makes them feel safer. But I find it is almost always a mistake. Sylvia clasped her cup with trembling hands. Julian came to see me last night. He was strange, not his usual self. He kept asking if Arthur had ever shown me anything from his private records. When I said no, he grew very angry. Said Arthur must have trusted me more than him. Then he asked if I believed in taking opportunities when they arose. A rather curious question, Miss Marple observed mildly. He said, Sylvia swallowed her, that if we were clever we could still salvage something from this, that the police were looking at Edward and it might be best if things stayed that way. Miss Marple, I may be weak and foolish and worse, but I am not wicked. I told him I wouldn't be part of anything like that. He left in a fury. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Fear, yes. Guilt, perhaps of a personal sort, but not the icy calculation she had often observed in the truly dangerous. Sylvia's emotions seemed too chaotic, too raw, to belong to someone who had orchestrated a precise poisoning and subsequent framing. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, his usual brusqueness unusually subdued. Miss Marple, there's been another incident. David Hartley was attacked on the footpath by the old mill early this morning. Attacked? Sylvia gasped. Struck from behind, Slack confirmed. Fortunately, only a glancing blow. He fell into the hedge instead of the river. Says he never saw his assailant, only heard footsteps and then felt the impact. His briefcase was rifled, but nothing apparently taken. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Nothing obvious, Inspector. But one imagines Mr. Hartley carries a mixture of legitimate and less legitimate documents. A missing forgery certificate or incriminating letter might not be something he'd immediately confessed to the police. Slack grunted, which is spent to Marple as a form of agreement. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Rosemary Cottage, this time insisting very sweetly on seeing Arthur's study, exactly as it was used, with the curtains drawn, and lamps positioned as they had been during the garden party. She moved slowly about the room, noting the angles of light, the position of the armchair by the French doors, the exact distance between the desk, the safe, and the spot where Arthur had fallen. Mr. Penhaligon was a creature of habit, I fancy, she remarked. He would have had a particular place for everything. Bills here, correspondence there, private matters were perhaps not where one might expect at all. Her fingers drifted, apparently absently, along the central bookcase. The third shelf from the bottom bore faint scratches along the edge, horizontal regular, suggesting recent movement. With a slight pressure, she found the warped area and a concealed spring gave way. A small panel slid back, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay a single object, a second, smaller safe, of an older, less impressive design than the wall installation. It was locked, but the presence of a keyhole rather than a dial immediately struck Miss Marple as significant. How very like Mr. Der Penhaligon, Schiffruppenwell. A magnificent modern safe for show, and a modest old-fashioned one for what truly mattered. When she turned, she saw Julian standing in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes fixed on the newly revealed compartment. Not fear alone now, but something closer to despair. Miss Marple smiled at him, all gentle innocence. I was just thinking, Mr. Penhaligon, how very inconvenient it must be to have valuable things locked away when one doesn't know quite where the key is. His reaction to this seemingly harmless remark told her more than any confession could. The gathering at Rosemary Cottage the following afternoon had none of the gaiety of the garden party that had preceded Arthur Penhaligon's death. The same drawing room that had once echoed with forced laughter, and the clink of teacups, now held a far more subdued assembly. Julian Penhaligon, pale and tight-lipped. Sylvia Poole, driftwood, nervously twisting her handkerchief. Edward Vance, released under supervision and looking like a man reprieved from the gallows. David Hartley, outwardly composed, but betraying his tension through the constant straightening of his cufflinks, and Inspector Slack, who stood near the fireplace with her arms folded, wearing the wary, suppressed expression of someone who suspected he was being led, however gently, away from his preferred conclusions. Miss Marple sat in the same chintz-covered chair she had occupied on the day of the garden party, her knitting resting in her lap. The position gave her an excellent view of every face in the room, for an advantage she never underestimated. I asked you all here, she began, her tone mild, because it seemed to me that poor Mr. Penhaligon's death has caused rather more confusion than is strictly necessary. There are, you see, certain little points that do not quite fit with the explanations currently being considered. Julian gave a short, brittle laugh. Little points? My uncle is dead, I'm under suspicion, and Mr. Vance here is being painted as some sort of criminal mastermind. Forgive me if my attention has not been on details. Oh, but criminals are so often undone by details, Miss Marple said gently. Take, for instance, the matter of Mr. Penhaligon's tea. We know it contained a carefully measured dose of digitalis, and we know that at the crucial moment a delightful distraction involving Mrs. Price Ridley's hat and the fish pond, everyone rushed away, leaving the cups unattended. Exactly, Hartley interjected quickly. Any one of us might have... Not quite, Mr. Marple interrupted, her voice still kind but cool. Most of the guests remained near to the pond for some minutes. Only 3 people approached the tea table during that interval. Mr. Poirot, Julian, who refilled his cup, Miss Sylvia, who changed hers for one with less sugar, and Mr. Vance, who came only as far as the terrace before being called back by Mr. Penhaligon regarding some papers. Slack looked up sharply. How do you know that, Miss Marple? Because, she replied placidly, I was there, sitting under the oak tree with my knitting, as I so often am at village events. Old ladies are like furniture, Inspector. People forget we are capable of observation. A slight flush rose in Slack's cheeks, but he subsided, listening. Now, Miss Marple continued, if we assume that the poisoner needed Mr. Penhaligon to die at a very specific time, soon after he entered this room, at 4:30, it follows that the dose must have been measured with considerable precision. That suggests not simple malice, but knowledge. Knowledge of digitalis, of timing, and most importantly of exactly when Mr. Penhaligon would come inside to open his safe. Julian shifted uncomfortably. Sylvia stared at the carpet. Hartley's hand went to his cufflinks again. It was no coincidence, Miss Marple said softly, that Mr. Penhaligon chose that precise moment to enter his study. He had been summoned here by this about. From her reticule, she produced the scrap of expensive paper she had found near the hydrangeas, now carefully unfolded. Hartley inhaled sharply. Julian's eyes widened. You will notice, Miss Marple continued, the remnants of a hastily torn message and the distinctive watermark from a certain London hotel. The rest of the note I suspect can go back to invited Mr. Penhaligon to bring specific documents from his hidden safe at a particular hour. Documents relating to fraudulent manuscript authentications and questionable financial arrangements. Hartley spoke first, his voice hoarse. I never wrote such a note. Oh, I quite agree, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. I don't believe you did. Your involvement, Mr. Hartley, lay elsewhere, in providing forged provenance for certain manuscripts, and accepting payment through channels Mr. Vance was instructed to disguise as legitimate purchases. That arrangement might have continued indefinitely, had not Mr. Penhaligon begun asking awkward questions. She turned her gaze to Julian. But summoning Arthur to his study at precisely 4:30 and ensuring he would open both his wall safe and his hidden one, that required someone who knew not only his habits, but the existence of both tapes and the nature of the documents inside. Julian's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. And that, Miss Marple concluded quietly, is where the real murderer made his crucial mistake. In assuming that only Arthur knew about his hidden arrangements, he forgot that people in villages talk, and that housekeepers and old ladies notice more than they are given credit for. The silence that followed was heavy, electric, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Inspector Slack straightened, his attention now fully engaged. Miss Marple's gentle voice had shifted something essential in the room. Alliances, excuses, and carefully constructed facades seemed suddenly much less secure. There remained, she knew, one more test. A final deliberate pressure to be applied at just the right point. Human nature, when cornered, rarely failed to reveal itself. The days that followed brought a curious blend of relief and unease to St. Mary Mead. The arrest of Mrs. Albivines, Bantock, so long regarded as a pillar of quiet reliability, sent shockwaves through the list that no amount of police discretion could soften. That such a crime, so coldly reasoned and carefully executed, had been conceived in a mind associated primarily with well-risen sions and spotless linen, struck at the very heart of what people like to believe about themselves and their neighbours. At the Blue Boar, where conversation usually revolved around weather and wartime shortages long past, David Hartley sat opposite Inspector Slack, his professional facade worn thin. The inspector, eager to make the most of his opportunity, had wasted little time in presenting Hartley with Arthur Penhaligon's recovered notebook and a selection of incriminating correspondence unearthed from Mrs. Bantock's trunk. Pressed between economic self-interest and the weight of evidence, Hartley chose what cooperation remained open to him. He admitted in careful phrases to having supplied forged manuscripts to Arthur through the mediation of a trusted intermediary, a woman who understood domestic rhythms and private habits far better than any London dealer. The broader fraud ring, stretching from discreet backrooms in the Strand to certain continental suppliers, would take months to untangle. In the immediate sense, however, Hartley's confession confirmed what Miss Marple had already concluded. Arthur had died not because of family quarrels, though they had played their noisy part, but because he had been methodical enough to start documenting the truth. Miss Marple heard the broad strokes from Inspector Slack over tea at the vicarage. He delivered his report with the air of a man who had, he felt, emerged from a complicated matter rather creditably, though he remained faintly irked that the decisive insight had not been entirely his own. "I'll say this for you, Miss Marple," he conceded at last, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigour. "You were right about the small things. The timing, the tea, that telephone call. I kept looking at the safe and the nephew and the money. You kept looking at who brought the tray. It is so often the person who appears merely to serve," Miss Marple replied mildly, "who has access to the most private parts of people's lives. Bedrooms, studies, kitchen cupboards. I've always thought one can tell a great deal about character from what people keep in their lards." Slack gave her a look suggesting that, though he did not follow her reasoning, he had learned not to dismiss it. "Well, at any rate, we've got them. Hartley will face his own music in London, and Mrs. Bantock—" He broke off, uncomfortable. It's a bad business, all told. At Rosemary Cottage, the business of death proceeded with its usual decorum. The final valid will, the charitable one Arthur had so carefully concealed, was reconstructed from drafts and solicitors' notes. The court accepted it, given corroborating evidence in his notebook. Julian received a modest, face-saving bequest. Sylvia rather less, though enough for independence if managed with a care she had not previously exercised. Sylvia came to visit Miss Marple a week later, her air subdued but freer, somehow, than it had ever been while engaged to Arthur. "I was cruelly foolish," she admitted, looking down at her gloved hands. "I thought I could manage things, my past, my debts, David. I told myself I was doing no real harm. Arthur was kind to me in his way, but I didn't love him. I suppose I loved the safety he seemed to offer." "Safety built on misrepresentation," Miss Marple replied gently, "is a most treacherous sort. But you did, in the end, refuse to let an innocent man bear the blame. That sort of a choice matters, I think, more than the mistakes that preceded it." As for Julian, he departed quietly for a position with a firm in Birmingham, arranged through the vicar's brother-in-law. The village consensus, always quick to harden into something resembling judgment, allowed that he had behaved very badly indeed, but that youthful greed and cowardice, while deplorable, were not unforgivable. Time and distance would do their work. On a soft sunlit afternoon some weeks later, Miss Marple sat once more beneath the old oak tree in her garden, her knitting lying idle in her lap. The roses were in better order than those at Rosemary Cottage, where a temporary housekeeper wrestled with both dust and memory. A murder 10 feet from an open safe had, in this end, had very little to do with force safe at all. That had been the stysod, not the drama. The real play, Miss Marple reflected, had unfolded in the quiet spaces, in the kitchen where tea was brewed, in the telephone calls placed out of earshot, in the private resentments of a clever woman who had grown tired of merely keeping house for other people's luxuries. People would go on saying, as they always did, that such things might happen in London, perhaps even abroad, but never really here. Yet St. Mary Mead, in its tranquil lanes and well-swept doorsteps, contained all the necessary materials: ambition, humiliation, vanity, fear. Given the right opportunity, they arranged themselves into tragedy with frightening ease. Miss Marple took up her needles again, the familiar rhythm settling her thoughts. Human nature, she knew, did not change, whether in a gold-broker's villa or a labourer's cottage. It merely expressed itself through whatever circumstances lay at hand: foxglove leaves in a summer garden, blue wax on a study carpet, a housekeeper's key on an unmarked ring. And that, she thought with a small, almost sorrowful smile, was why one must always pay attention to the little things. It was some weeks later, on an afternoon soft with late summer light, that Miss Marple sat with Dolly Bantry in the vicarage garden, the events at Rosemary Cottage having, in village fashion, settled from immediate drama into well-handled anecdote. The lawns were freshly mown, bees droned lazily about the lavender beds, and the world on the surface had righted itself. "I must say, Jane," Dolly observed, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigour, "it's put me quite off housekeepers. One never feels entirely safe sending one into the linen cupboard after such goings-on. Poisoning and forged manuscripts and hidden safes. It all sounds much too modern for St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature doesn't modernise quite so quickly as all that, Dolly. It merely finds new instruments, methods. Bantock's methods may have involved forged medieval psalters instead of altered accounts at the draper's, but the underlying principle remains much the same: greed, wounded, vanity, and a sense of injured entitlement." Dolly shivered delicately. Still, to think of her in Arthur Penhaligon's kitchen, pouring out his tea each day, watching him trust her with everything, and all the while plotting, it's positively indecent. Geoffrey says the forgery case will cause a great stir in London collecting circles. Apparently Arthur wasn't the only victim. "I dare say not," Miss Marple replied. "Organised wickedness is very rarely content with a single opportunity. Once people discover they can deceive successfully, they find it very difficult to stop. It becomes a habit." There was a comfortable silence. The church clock chimed 4, a sound that now, for Miss Marple, carried an additional shade of meaning. 4 o'clock, Arthur's fatal tea. 4:30, his final doomed walk to the study. Dolly, ever curious, leaned forward. "Tell me honestly, Jane, when did you first suspect Margaret Bantock? Everyone else was so sure about Julian, or that Hartley man, or even poor Sylvia. You seem to treat all those theories as, well, as so much embroidery." Miss Marple's needles clicked a few times before she spoke. "It was nothing very grand, my dear. Mrs. Bantock displayed a most unusual interest in matters outside her proper sphere, asking about manuscript paper, ink composition, auction procedures. That is never a good sign. One expects a housekeeper to care about laundry starch and coal deliveries, not parchment dating methodologies." Dolly laughed despite herself. "You and your patterns? You really believe every person has their little template, so to speak?" "Oh, indeed. One learns to recognise them in the village, the way Mr. Tomkins rounds down the weights when he thinks no one is looking, or how Mrs. Price Ridley repeats a story with very slight improvements each time. With Mrs. Bantock, it was her habit of recounting Arthur's movements with such precise accuracy. That kind of vigilance is rarely disinterested. And then, of course, there was the telephone." "The telephone?" "Yes. Edward Vance heard a woman's voice that sent Arthur rushing indoors. People forget that telephones in houses like Rosemary Cottage are very often answered by servants. Mrs. Bantock knew how Arthur reacted to certain names, certain institutions. It would have been quite simple for her to imitate the tone of some imagined London expert, and Arthur, already in a state of suspicion about his manuscripts, would respond at once. Dolly regarded her for a moment. "You never really doubted Julian?" "I thought Julian might very well destroy the evidence," Miss Marple said mildly. "But there is a difference between panicked stupidity and calculated murder. His legal schemes were foolish, selfish, and distressingly common, but they lacked the cold neatness one sees in true criminal planning. It was Mrs. Bantock who showed that quality. Her careful framing of Edward, her timing of the tea, her attempt to bury the genuine manuscripts rather than the forgeries." From the road beyond the hedge came the familiar sound of village life. A bicycle bell, a child's shout, the clop of a passing cart. Dolly sighed. "Well, at least it's over. Rosemary Cottage will have a new owner soon enough, and people will have something else to talk about. Mrs. Jeffries is already spreading rumours about a colonel from Shropshire with a mysterious niece." "Life goes on," Miss Marple agreed. "It must. But I fancy the village will be just a little more cautious about whom it trusts in the kitchen." She paused, then added thoughtfully, "Though in time, of course, people forget. They always do. That is both a mercy and a danger." Later, walking home along the lane bordered by hawthorn hedges, Miss Marple reflected on the curious comfort of ordinary things, the rattle of milk bottles, the smell of wood smoke, the way Mrs. Hartnell still overwatered her geraniums. Murder, she had often observed, did not so much tear the fabric of village life as reveal the seams already present. The small resentments, the guarded secrets, the quiet acts of desperation. Yet even with that knowledge, she felt no bitterness, only a kind of resigned tenderness for human frailty. At her cottage gate she paused to deadhead a rose, and watched for a moment as the sun slipped behind the church tower, casting long shadows across the green. Somewhere in the distance a telephone rang, a perfectly ordinary sound, now and again the herald of something that would alter lives forever. Miss Marple went inside, set on the kettle, and reached for her knitting. There would be, she had no doubt, other murders in other seemingly peaceful places. Human nature, after all, did not change, but for now St. Mary Mead was quiet, and that, she thought, was enough. Winter came early to St. Mary Mead that year, the first frost etching delicate patterns on cottage windows and lending a sharp clarity to the air. With the Penhaligon affair now resigned to newspaper archives and distant court calendars, the village had settled into its familiar rhythms once more. Choir practice at the church, disputations over jam at the Women's Institute, and the steady passage of gossip along the high street like a relay baton. Yet traces of the case remained, subtle but persistent, like footprints half lost in new snow. Rosemary Cottage did not stand empty for long. A quiet couple from London, a retired schoolmaster and his wife, took possession, attracted by the roses and the reputation of a very secure safe, as the estate agent ironically described it. The famous wall safe remained, its imposing door now used chiefly to store family papers and old Christmas decorations. The concealed inner safe, at Miss Marple's suggestion, had been removed and donated to a small museum in Bath as a curiosity from a notorious local case, thereby signalling that its peculiar history was better kept as caution than as temptation. Julian Penhaligon came down from London once more before the cottage changed hands. He visited Miss Marple in her sitting room, bringing a box of particularly good chocolates and an air of sober humility that sat oddly on his once careless features. "I don't suppose," he began awkwardly, "that any amount of contrition can alter how badly I behaved while my uncle was alive." "Remorse rarely comes in time to be useful to the person most wronged," Miss Marple said gently, "but it can still do a great deal for those who feel it." He told her of his decision to accept a junior position in a firm unconnected with his uncle's interests. No more speculation, no more shortcuts, and no expectations of fortune simply falling into his lap. "I'd rather earn what I have now," he concluded. "Your village has a way of stripping illusions, Miss Marple." She only smiled and offered him another chocolate. Sylvia Driftwood left St. Mary Mead quietly one foggy morning, a small travelling case in hand, and no admirer waiting at the gate this time. She came to say farewell to Miss Marple, who insisted on packing a woolen scarf and a packet of sandwiches into her bag, with the brisk practicality of one who had seen many. Young women go out into the world badly provisioned. "I imagine," Mr. Marple said mildly, "that London will suit you better when you are not forever looking over your shoulder. And perhaps this time, my dear, you will choose your friends rather more carefully." "I intend to choose myself more carefully," Sylvia answered, with a wry little sooty smile. "That was Arthur's last advice to me, you know. He said, don't think in terms of the men you might marry, think in terms of the woman you want to be." Well, I didn't listen in time for him to see it, but I can at least try. The doctor, Haydock, calling later that afternoon, found Miss Marple darning a pair of gloves with her usual neat precision. "So, Jane," he remarked, settling into his accustomed chair, "another case tidied up. One would think you'd be satisfied." "I am, in a way," she said, "though tidied up is such a curious phrase. People are not drawers to be straightened and closed. Julian will carry his guilt, Sylvia her shame, and even poor Mrs. Bantock, for all her wickedness, began as something quite ordinary, Brenrose, before temptation took root. You still pity her after all she did." "Pity is not the same as excuse," Miss Marple replied. "But I have observed that evil, in villages as elsewhere, rarely appears fully formed. It starts in such small ways: envy of a richer employer, irritation at a careless remark, the discovery that one small deception can go unnoticed, as Bantock merely walked further down a path that many people begin upon. That is what makes her so dangerous and so instructive." She looked out at the frostbright garden, where the last stubborn roses had finally succumbed to the cold. Arthur Penhaligon locked his treasures behind steel and secret numbers, yet what destroyed him came on a tray with his afternoon tea. "One must always remember, Doctor, that the real safes in life are not made of metal at all. They are made of character, of choices, of the people one allows into one's confidence." "And you," Haydock said dryly, "keep your treasures in knitting bags and old teapots." "They have served me very well," Miss Marple answered, serenely. Outside, St. Mary Mead went on much as it always had. Children to school, post to sort, vegetables to be dug before the hard frosts. Murder had visited and moved on, leaving only honeyed ripples on the surface of village life. Yet beneath that surface, for those with eyes to see, human nature continued its intricate, perilous dance, ever the same and ever capable of surprising. Miss Marple threaded her needle, set aside her spectacles, and reached once more for her knitting. So long as there were people, there would be secrets, and so long as there were secrets, there would be work for an old lady with sharp eyes and an attentive mind in a small, deceptively tranquil English village. Imperceptibly,